Well, it's great to be here during Tech Week, and I hope you're enjoying the conference and all the things that are going on around town. As was mentioned, I have a background myself in technology, although now I'm mainly involved in politics and policy. I was living in East London, which is where we have Shoreditch Tech City, 15 years ago, before it sort of blossomed, and it's been a fantastic ride. What I want to talk a bit about, though, today is the future, and the future of work, and where it's all heading as we develop more new technologies, particularly around the Internet of Everything, the Internet of Things. And having worked myself in the tech industry, having been involved as a venture capital investor, there are certain things I'm a bit worried about that I think we need to kind of wake up to and do something about together. So, first of all, let's think about technology. I mean, universally, you come to a conference like this and you come to a week like this, and the news is generally always positive, right? We are those of us who work in this sector, we're eternal optimists. The future is bright. And in fact, I was on Bloomberg early in the week, and that's the headline they took away from the interview that I gave. And without a doubt, our lives have improved. I think we spend most of our lives on our phones. I think the transport on the way here didn't quite work. I had to get an Uber in order to get here on time to speak to you. Just illustrates the convenience and the low costs involved. That's part of the benefit of technology. It's changing everything from business, lifestyles, even how we date people is being transformed by technology. It's all wonderful. However, what we're starting to see emerging, and perhaps we don't talk about it as much, is there are some downsides. Such a huge disruption that we've seen over the last 5, 10, 15 years is starting to have an impact on livelihoods, the real economy, on the nature of cities, even entire countries. And just to illustrate this, here are some of the most recent hot technologies and hot brands over the last kind of year or so. And you know, they're incredible, aren't they? They're amazing. I remember sitting in a breakfast meeting with one of the heads of Google about a year ago, and he started talking about what they were doing with the self-driving cars, and now we see Ubers everywhere. And we were all amazed. But we did say, well, fantastic, we've got people able to make a living driving an Uber, but what's going to happen in 5, 10, 15 years when the cars drive themselves? What's going to happen to all those people who are driving Ubers, let alone the people whose livelihoods Uber is disrupting? And then what about WhatsApp? I think it was bought for about $19 billion by Facebook last year. How many people did it employ when it was bought? Less than 50. So we're in an age where not only is technology disrupting livelihoods and jobs in a fundamental way, but we're not even sure how many jobs it's actually creating. You know, when I was growing up, which wasn't long ago, if you spent $19 billion on something, you'd expect to create a lot of jobs. There's no guarantee of that anymore. And then we can see with, we all don't know whether Amazon Prime Air is a gimmick or not, but certainly even areas like postal delivery are starting to be revolutionized by new technologies, robotics and so on and so forth. Now, the way people experience the impact of this is not very direct. They don't necessarily realize that the last 5, 10 years, at least, as technology has kind of driven forward, as we started to use smart devices, that's having an impact on income levels. People just experience that as, well, real estate's going up, particularly in areas like Shoreditch, where I live, or San Francisco, Hong Kong, any creative cluster in the world, real estate prices going up. And to a large extent, that's partly because we've printed a lot of money, and that money has to go somewhere, so it goes into tech startups, and it goes into art, and it goes into real estate. But what people experience is a certain kind of stagnation in their wages. Eric Schmidt, I think, recently said that for every coding job that's created, they create 7 new jobs, which is fantastic. But the 7 new jobs, I think, on the whole, are things like working as a tasker for TaskRabbit, or driving an Uber. They're great. It's great. It's better to have a job than no job. But they're not necessarily jobs where you might say it's a secure, long-term job with a future where you own something necessarily, at least not for the majority of people. So in some parts of the world, San Francisco, London a few years ago, Hong Kong last year, there's a sense of discontentment in certain communities that's building up, particularly ones that can't access the coding jobs, the graphic design jobs that we're creating, in the technology sector. And all it takes is for something minor locally to trigger that. For example, Google buses, for them to get really angry and for that to spark something. And I've been calling this phenomenon that's sort of started to bubble over the last 12, 18 months, Techlash. That risk that certain communities, certain people may find that they're excluded from the tech boom and the tech industry, and they're not able to access the asset appreciation that that's creating. Instead, they feel a sense of resentment. And at some point, that will turn, and maybe those of us who work in the tech industry will be just as embarrassed as bankers and treated as badly, sadly, as some bankers are. In fact, I know in Oakland, when I was in the Bay Area end of last year, some of the Google employees I spoke to said they don't actually say they work for Google anymore, for those of them who live in Oakland, because there's a risk that they'll get beaten up, which I think is actually quite shocking that we can get to that point. So what can we do about it? Well, there is hope on its way. I think right now, the way technology is moving forwards, those of us who work in technology, particularly many of the founders, believe we're helping the world. We're providing information, we're providing services in the developed and developing world, which were never available before. Arguably, the likes of Google and now Baidu and others, the search engines, have done more for global literacy, let's say, even in places like Africa, than any charitable literary program in history. There's no doubt about it. But now the technology phenomenon is so big that it's affecting entire labor markets, entire economies. And that means we not only need to look at the consumer side of the equation, we need to look at the producer, jobs, working. And I think that the coming wave of making, the maker revolution, whatever you want to call it, Internet of Things, Internet of Everything, where digital is invading the physical world, presents us with an opportunity to correct some of these imbalances. And the beauty of it is, it's being led by, I don't like using the term, millennials. Now, I'm a kind of tail-end Gen X. I'm technically almost part of Steve Jobs' generation. And we just wanted to rule the world. We didn't want to create necessarily massive companies, but we wanted to challenge the old sort of dinosaur companies that we felt were kind of making life really boring. And we like, MTV and all of that kind of stuff. And we're very happy to kind of reshape the world in our image. Many of the hipsters and millennials that I meet around the world, in San Francisco, in London, even in Asia, yeah, that's interesting, but that's what my generation did. They don't just want to make they don't just want to make money and make a dent in the world. They want to change the world for the better. And so making presents the opportunity to do that. So how do you do that? Given where we're going with the development of robotics, artificial intelligence, all kinds of technologies which in some ways are going to potentially displace human labor, what can we do? Well, I'm not, for one, advocating that we fight it. In fact, I think we should embrace it. I think there's no point in being an enemy of progress. It's just kind of futile. And you can see that even with, say, Uber and traditional taxi car driving. There's no way you can fight that phenomenon, really, ultimately. What you can do is you can make the transition smoother. Because the reality is, wherever you come out in the argument whether new jobs will be created to replace all the jobs that go, the truth is that many people who will lose the jobs that are being destroyed won't necessarily get access to the new jobs that are coming. If you've lost your job because you don't drive an Uber car and you drive a traditional taxi cab in London, there's no guarantee you're going to become a coder. Right? Now, we had a similar phenomenon in the UK 20, 30 years ago when our mining industry was closing down. And now many of the miners and their families up in the north of England, and this is the same around the world, shipbuilders, never managed to get the new jobs which are in London in banking and finance as we opened up our financial sector. However, at the time, there was what was called a transition plan between the miners, the coal board, and the government. It was all very hush-hush, very secret. And that was to move all the mining to gas fracking, which only now we're trying to do, which if they had successfully done, potentially we wouldn't have lost the 2 or 3 decades and vast economic impact of those industries dying out. Unfortunately, at the time, the Prime Minister of the day, Margaret Thatcher, and some of the leaders of the miners had such a kind of political fight that that plan was never activated. But really, what we need now, in my view, is a transition plan for every job or every job's type in the world that's going to be affected by robotics, artificial intelligence, in the distance, big data. There were surveys, research out in the last 12 to 24 months that suggested that in the UK, 37% of all jobs will be displaced in some way by technology, big data, robotics, eventually artificial intelligence. In America, it's an even bigger number, 47%. In the UK, that's representing about 3 million jobs over the next sort of 10, 15 years. And obviously a much larger number in America. And around the world, you can find a number, you can pick a number somewhere between that depending on how large your manufacturing and services sector is. So let's have a look at one particular industry or job that's going to change. And we can do this for thousands of different kinds of jobs. I run a co-working space that's now in London and Palo Alto. I'll talk about that in a minute, called Maker Wharf. And we have a number of makers in there working on technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, virtual reality filming. And one of our makers is making a robot that's due to launch on Kickstarter very soon that can actually lift things, and it can recognize human faces. And it can do multiple, it's like a general purpose robot. So one of the things that it can do is it can serve you a drink, like a Coke. In fact, he did a sponsorship deal with Coke. And the robot went up and down Palo Alto High Street, recognizing humans and offering people Coke, right? And so I had a round table, and he was part of that round table with a bunch of robot companies from the Bay Area. And we basically said, well, what's going to happen to all the waitressing jobs in the world if your robot starts to, go into the mainstream? And he said something very interesting. If you look at the number of, this is a chart of the number of restaurant visits in America last year. 65% of them were in fast food restaurants. It was about 40 billion restaurant visits in America last year. There are no waiters or waitresses in a McDonald's. Yes, there's somebody who maybe cleans the table, and there's people behind the counter, but there's nobody serving you a drink necessarily after you've bought your hamburger or whatever it is. So what this shows, combined with this, which is that when they tested the robot in Palo Alto, 3 times more people took a Coke than when it was served by a human. Now, if a robot serves you Coke in Palo Alto on the high street, you're probably going to drink it. So this is probably an inflated number. But even if it was much lower than this, that means that there is a business case for putting 1 million robots in McDonald's alone. And who's going to look after the robots? Those are net new jobs. In future, we'll say there weren't any robots and there weren't any people looking after the robots. So that's a lot of jobs we can create just for this one type of job category. Now, the guys on the left who serve in diners and in sort of mid-tier restaurants, they're the ones we have to worry about. They're the ones that need to change their role from being serving the food to probably tasting the food, rating the food. And there's probably one waiter or waitress in the world who has the exact same taste as you one day, who you will tip or pay to recommend the food to you. And maybe they will or won't serve you the food, or maybe the robot will serve the food. It's the experience. There's a lot of retraining that they're going to have to do to tell you where your food comes from, what it tastes like, to give you the history of the food, entertainment, essentially. And the guys in the fine dining category will probably retain them as humans, at least until AI means that those guys' jobs will go too. Another quick example is security. We were holding this roundtable on one of the leading security robotics companies from the Bay Area called Nightscope. I don't know if you've heard of it. We're there as well. And they sell robots which have a bubble on the top. They're a bit like the robot from Lost in Space, I think. And they're now bought by companies, mainly in the West Coast, but also around the world, to actually go around the campus, the corporate campus, and make sure there aren't any intruders. And they have a degree of AI in them as well to recognize when trouble's kicking off, right? So again, in this roundtable, we said, so what are we going to do about all the millions of people employed as security personnel all around the world, maybe tens of millions? And what we realized is actually there's also going to be 2 new jobs that will be created once you install those robots. And I think there are discussions about replacing policemen in America, especially, with these robots, because they don't necessarily shoot people as readily. But anyway, two groups of people. One, you need a SWAT team, because the robot at the moment can't arrest a human, and you probably don't want them to arrest a human who happens to be on your corporate campus. So you need some very fit, able people to descend and then eject the person, right? If they don't want to go by themselves. And then you need another person who literally sits behind a desk the whole day with 20 screens and 20 robots. And when they notice something is kicking off, they quite forcefully shout to the people who should be off the campus and tell them to go. And if they don't go, then you get the SWAT team. So we were thinking, what kind of job currently involves sitting behind a dashboard for the whole day and not always being in the best mood? It's arguable. Well, what we realized is, and I don't know this, and I don't know if it's true, and apologies to anybody that's from that industry, but one of the reasons why Uber is so successful in the Bay Area is because some of the traditional cab drivers have a bit of a reputation for not being the best at, say, customer service. They sit behind a dashboard all day, and they basically drive a vehicle around. And that's why perhaps Uber's had the way in. I'm not saying everyone is in that situation, but if you have thousands of people who may lose their jobs, eventually because of self-driving cars, what can they do in the new world? And that's really what this example shows. And you can do this for every single sector and apply every technology, from serving food to driving car. Driving articulated lorries is probably the first set of 10 million jobs in America will go because of self-driving trucks. It's more likely we'll have self-driving trucks than we'll have self-driving cars, just because of the fuel economy involved. So that's, but if we do it right, we can transition people into more interesting work, higher-end work. But we need to make sure there's still enough manual labor for those people who aren't necessarily geared to doing just pure knowledge work. And ultimately, we need more self-employed jobs, or at least for people to own shares. Because as technology goes forward, our labor, even those of us who are knowledge workers, our work won't be enough to make a living for us, because work will get commoditized. It's ownership of something, a company, art, a house, something scarce that robots, big data, AI can't do, that allows you to generate wealth. And so part of the plan needs to involve not just giving people jobs, but actually giving people access to own their own companies. Or, I fear, some companies, some of the bigger tech companies now will have all of the assets, all of the robots, and the rest of us will be employed by the robots to do the work that the robots can't do. I don't want to paint a too dystopian future. I think the reality will be somewhere in between, but I think it's worth preparing for it. So in a very, very small way in London, starting out of London, I've been involved in a project called Make a Wharf, which you can see it's online now, makerwharf.cc. And on a fundamental level, it's essentially a co-working space for maker companies. We take many of London's scale-up companies that are now coming out of Google Campus and many of the other incubators who need space for 5 to 15 people. We find it's a bit like an Airbnb model. We find underutilized space, church halls, other companies that have space, and we pop up a co-working space within their spaces, but specifically for IoT, especially for IoT and makers. And we provide a home for these companies. But many of them are ones that have come out of the Kickstarter kind of crowd and movement. But what we also do alongside them is we provide a base for freelance makers working in innovative areas like robotics, like virtual reality filming, and all of these really interesting areas. And we're hooking them up with some of the bigger traditional industries here in the Bay Area, in Asia, who have no idea about IoT, have no idea about these technologies, and who want to work together to start to develop new supply chains using these technologies that will both improve productivity in all of our economies and at the same time create loads of new jobs. I'll give you an example. in our co-working space, we had to implement, actually we went through 3 different technologies, Lockytron, Goji, actually 4, Kivo, and we ended up with Sherlock. It's a smart lock, right? It's just so that our community manager doesn't have to keep opening the door all the time. You can use your smartphone. We went through 5 locksmith companies because they didn't know how to install this smart lock. Right? So suddenly we're thinking, companies that deal with traditional, the making and the installation of locks and equipment actually need to get up to speed. Otherwise, some Uber is going to come along and completely wipe them out, right? But if you do it right, not only will they develop a new product line, new business, installing these smart locks everywhere, but they will also be the key conduit by which smart home technology within the home, because, you know, it's all right for us first adopters who love technology to install Internet of Things devices into our homes. It's another thing to ask somebody who, you know, an ordinary member of the public. And one of the first entry points is the lock on the door, right? So that was just one example, but there are many, many others that we're working on. So here's a number of the companies. In fact, this list needs to be updated. We have a number of the leading hardware IoT companies now based out of our initial space. There was an article last week. It's in a place called Haggerston, which has been half-jokingly nicknamed Hackerston. We're now proliferating hardware companies in that general area. And we're opening in Palo Alto this month, 5 minutes from Stanford, just off the high street. And I'm going to Hong Kong to talk to partners about opening there. 3 initial locations, which will enable us to follow the Kickstarter journey. Launch in London, get your video, your media done here, go to Hong Kong and Shenzhen, sort out your product development, go to the Bay Area, as well as here as well, and sort out your financing. The space, I'm not going to go into the detail of it, doubles as an art gallery. There's a whole bunch of other things that we do in there. But we're really there using it as a base to train the makers of the future, both those who will create companies multiple times bigger than Apple, because 90% of the economy is still not internet-based. The Internet of Things will kind of invade that part of the economy. But also to instill this set of values to create local entry-level jobs for people. You know, if you have a 3D printing company, there are more jobs you can create potentially for people who don't know anything about tech. Just to start with, the printers need cleaning every day. They get blocked. I mean, believe me. And if you have 50 of them, you're starting to create a job. Similarly, if you're running a virtual reality filming company and you need to film in each location, you need people to kind of serve the tea and the coffee. And that's, again, an entry-level job. It's called a runner. And then on the job, they can learn the technical aspect, the coding, the hardware, and get from where they are now to where they need to be. When I visited the Bay Area, there was a community called, an area called East Palo Alto. I don't know if any of you know it. It's a scandal. There are 30,000 mainly black, mainly unemployed people surrounded by the headquarters of Apple, Google, Facebook. We've been talking to the non-profits working, there are many of them working in that area. One of them teaches single moms how to sew, and they sell the goods on Etsy. And I said, that's great, but it's a commodity. Everybody in America is selling stuff on Etsy. Why don't we go to Google, Apple, talk to their employees, and offer them a service where we can sew a pocket to put tiles in so they can track their clothing, and maybe charge them, $50 per pocket. They're not really price sensitive if you work for Google, Apple. That kind of thing alone would create full employment in East Palo Alto, tapping into the potential of the maker revolution, the Internet of Things, to create service-level jobs, but ones which have a future. It's sort of like the future of wearable clothing is wearable tailors, right? Someone who knows your measurements will help you fit you out in the right gear. So right now, the vision is to have these 3 initial locations and then to roll out everywhere else. So if somebody wants to come forward and roll out Make a Wolf in France, come and talk to me. If you want to do it in Texas, come and talk to me. We're going to franchise the model as fast as we can. And that eventually means that we can deal with hyper-local organizations at the very local level who've got space and they want to pop up this kind of initiative in their community, as well as some of the biggest companies in the world who will need to have makers in every neighborhood. And we'd love your help to be part of this movement in several ways. One, you may be in London or East London or anywhere else, and your company or your organization has space, and you'd like to have a Maker Wharf in your space and have some of these interesting companies as they scale around the world come into in your city, your town. If that's you, then come and talk to me or tweet me on Twitter at NatWei, and we can work together. I've got what I found is by doing the Airbnb model, talking to people about underutilized space, there's 10 to 15 times more places suddenly in East London alone than if I'd just gone for straight, space that's available for rent on the open market. And we need space in London. We have so many startups that need to scale up that they can't quite find a place to grow into. Similarly, you may be a company or maybe an organization that wants to be close to making, or you are a maker company, you are an Internet of Everything company, and you want to join our community and be part of shaping the values of it, not just so that you rule the world, but so that we kind of create some of these, a bit of balance in the universe. And one of the reasons why we've attracted some of the hottest IoT companies in London to our London space is because we have that mission. They don't want to go just to another, co-working space. They want to go where the people around them have the same values, right? And that's what we're providing. So again, talk to us if that's what you want to do, or if you're looking for a place, maybe we can help you find it. And finally, maybe you want to be part of the core. Help us as we build out the technology platform, help us as we move into different places, think about the real estate aspect of it. There are other things we want to do around research. We want to create TED-style research roundtables in every city in the world, where we would start to map out what are the jobs that are going to go in the next year or two, and what are the new maker tech jobs that are going to be created that we can somehow accelerate, and how can we get people from here across to here in every city, every town in the world. And that'll be a huge research program that we're sort of kicking off in the next 6 to 12 months. So I think I'm going to stop there. I think I've probably spoken enough. I'll leave you with one final thought, and then I think if you want to ask any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. In the UK, we have this thing called the Job Centre. I don't know if you have heard of it. I don't know what it's called in different parts of the world, but it's a place you go. The government mainly runs it now, and it's where you go to get a job. Particularly, if you these days, if you're doing manual work and you're not maybe able to navigate LinkedIn quite the same way as the rest of us. Do you know who invented the Job Centre? Globally, 100 plus years ago. It's a guy called Winston Churchill. He was one of our most famous prime ministers in the UK before he won the war. And the Job Centre was created at a time when there was a similar crisis in the nature of work because of the Industrial Revolution. And here was a guy who basically won the war, inventing something that served its time. And what we need now moving forwards is a new vision of that Job Centre, a place where people can go, start up amazing companies that literally physically transform the world, but which at the same time create more opportunity for people who would be left behind by the tech revolution that has begun and which is going to get even more intensive in the many years to come. Thank you very much.
Hi. I come from Los Angeles, and there was a story in the LA Times about the worry of social security for people who are just doing jobs like Uber or being outsourced, basically. What do you think is the future of that to protect those employees, or they're not employees?
Yeah. I've been reading a lot of stories from the States about the idea of a kind of universal salary and so on. I'm a bit worried about that because in most democracies, if you have a bunch of people who are receiving this kind of benefit, it makes the others resent them, whether fairly or not. I would like to see more policy around encouraging asset ownership. For example, should we have a lower rate of corporate tax, company tax, for companies that distribute their shares more widely among their employees? I'm not very happy with the current trend in many of our VC investments, where typically it's mainly the founders now getting the bulk of the equity. 10, 20 years ago, if you were in Yahoo or some of the early internet companies, the cleaner would get equity. The guy or the girl who would open the mail would get equity, right? Something's changed in our tech industries, and I don't think that's fair. I don't think the founders of VC or tech would truly be happy with the way things are today. So we need to find policy ways to say, let's spread the benefit. You know, in the UK, we're all enamored with this model. John Lewis, it's a mainly employee-owned kind of department store, but with a much simpler governance, so the investors don't get spooked. We should be offering tax breaks to companies like that, so that more people don't just earn a wage, but they can tap into the equity of the business. That's what we need. Otherwise, the government will go bankrupt in the end if everybody's on a government wage, and it'll cause a lot of resentment.
I was wondering, so you gave examples of jobs that would be created from these, but do you really genuinely think that enough of them would be created from the offset? You know, like, yeah, you'd have to have someone managing the robots, but it would have to be less people than currently are being employed.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are several books about this at the moment, debating the economic argument. Will there be new jobs created to replace the ones that go? I think in the short term, there are likely to be more new jobs created than the ones that are destroyed. Because, I'll give you an example. Again, our maker makes this robot. It can be a lawnmower as well, right? And so I reasoned, actually, once that becomes universal, it's still going to be quite expensive. You know, it's going to be in the kind of $1,000 range, I think. So it's not something you necessarily buy. Not everyone will buy it. So that means there's an opportunity for somebody with an Uber-like app to ask to rent that robot, and then somebody in a big truck or a van will swing by your house, drop off the robot for a couple of hours, or that morning or that day, and for $4 or $5 or £10, now I don't pay anybody to mow my lawn at the moment because it's quite expensive, you know. So that's a new demand. Basically, I would not have been a customer of a human, let alone, but if it was cheap enough, I would, and that creates a job for somebody at a certain scale. The question is, if you leave it to purely the market to come up with that service, then it's only the guys with enough capital who will create the services, and they'll employ everybody as employees. Whereas if enough homegrown or sort of grassroots entrepreneurs figure out this is coming, and if we tell them it's coming, they can start to create those micro businesses, those trades of the future, if you like. And that's what we need. And many industries in the world today are still based on, like, Keiretsu, lots of small business that flow up to the big business. And it makes sense, right? Should the whole world literally just be 10 internet businesses that run everything, and then the rest of us are employed by them? I'm not even sure I'd want to run a company like that, you know. It's too much complexity to manage. Yeah.
Hi there. I wonder if I could ask, Stephen Hawkins has questioned the threat of artificial intelligence and computational intelligence to humans and robots. What's your view as to whether there's any credibility whatsoever with the issues and concerns he's raised?
Yeah. I'm very concerned. I mean, this is a very live, I mean, there's a television program that just came out in the UK. I think it came from Scandinavia, called Humans, that's just out, which is terrifying my entire family. The fact that we would let machines invade our world, we have done already, that can do something to us. Look, I sit on a European Select Committee in the House of Lords, and the last report we did was on drones. You know, we haven't even figured out what to do about autonomous drones among nations, let alone what happens if a terrorist group gets hold of a drone with artificial intelligence and takes out people just based on the way they look. I mean, it could be as simple as that, right? Now, that's just drones in a kind of weaponized environment. Think about all the other areas where AI can have an impact. We haven't figured out the security, we haven't figured out how we protect people, how we protect our information. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think the legislation, you know, the legislators like me are really playing catch up on this. And in the end, legislation alone might not even solve some of the problems. We're just going to have to adapt to being in a world that has some of these risks built into them. Yeah.
A lot of economists talk about, you know, the burger flipping economy to kind of denote low-skilled jobs. So the job creation you're talking about seems to kind of feed into that. And with that, you know, issues of, you know, classic economic issues of, an abundance of people in the workforce, wage stagnation, and all the economic issues that come around it. So, in the future, even though there are, numbers-wise, there might be job creation, what kind of value does that add to things like productivity, as well as wages?
Yeah. Actually, it adds a huge amount. I mean, the reality is we need to create a lot of blue-collar and low-skilled white-collar tech or maker jobs in future. We don't actually have a shortage of jobs. We have a huge shortage of net jobs, right? In London and the UK alone, we have, massive numbers of vacancies for people to do coding and all kinds of tech-related jobs. It's just that a lot of people don't have the skills yet to get into and our education yet is not able to supply an abundant number. And the reality is technology changes so fast that even if you train people to do a tech job today, certainly things like coding, there's no guarantee that it's relevant for tomorrow. I mean, I spent most of my childhood learning BASIC, and 90% of my time learning BASIC was debugging go-to routines where the program was was going to the wrong line. And then I was teaching my kid Raspberry Pi, and it's based on Python, which is all object-oriented programming, where there is no line, really. So I basically I spent 90% of my childhood learning the wrong thing. Of course, you learn logic and stuff like that, and that's important. But let me give you an example of the productivity impact when you start to implement this technology in a smart way. Actually, two examples. One is Reuters. Reuters recently brought AI into the writing of articles for share price movements. And they had quite a few, I can't remember, 100 or so or 200 writers who historically would write a little article about, share price went up or down today. And now robots write those articles, right? So did they lay off all of the journalists? No, the journalists are now writing interesting articles about companies. And the robots are writing thousands of share price articles, which was never humanly possible for the humans. So I think Reuters is financially benefiting ultimately from that. Another example, we have a company, tech company that creates sensors that go into waste, into dustbin, household waste collection, right? And they implemented in one of the cities in the north of England, in everybody's home, in their waste disposal outside, they put one of these smart bins, basically they call them, and the workers reduced the number of collections because they, didn't need to collect it all the time, from many thousands to something like 200 collections in that whole city a day. Now, did they lay off all the workers? No, actually, they redeployed the workers to do commercial waste collection, where the city actually earns money. So the city is now able to, make a surplus from its waste collection rather than make a loss. And similarly for the lorry drivers, if we can figure out what to do with all the future truck drivers in the world, truck driving is a horrible job. I mean, it literally destroys families. In an ideal world, people shouldn't be driving trucks. You know what I mean? If we can find something more productive for them to do, and ultimately this feeds into the economy. We'll all be richer when more people are doing jobs that they're interested in, but which match their skill level, and which mean that there's more surplus in companies, which then they feed through into either higher wages or investment. And then you get a virtuous cycle. Right now, we don't have that. Right now, we're not quite earning enough because of a whole bunch of reasons, but we still keep people on doing jobs which they're not interested in always, and which aren't that productive. Well, it's been great to be with you today. Do come and chat afterwards. I hope you enjoy the rest of Tech Week, and see you soon. Take care.